Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week we are hearing a collection of speeches from the Party for Socialism and Liberation's 2019 Eco-Socialism Conference. I was able to record the audio and attend the conference in Albuquerque. It was a very compelling and important conference and very timely. Essentially, it took place August 24th, just days after the Amazon fires were started. It appears to be by Brazilian fascist groups. So all of this, of course, to say it's very timely. These speeches, I believe, are very important, and I hope you are able to get a lot from these. So to kick us off, we're going to hear first from Karina Rogers. This is from August 24th of this year. Again, the Eco-Socialism Conference put on by Party for Socialism and Liberation, Albuquerque branch.
So as high temperatures break records across the globe and storms ravage communities along the coast, we are seeing more and more with each passing year the deadly and devastating impacts of global warming and the current climate crisis we face. As we've heard from our first plenary, capitalism is the main contributor of climate change. The most common response to this crisis is to place complete emphasis on green technologies as a solution. Technologies that minimize the effects of polluting industries, divert from fossil fuel use, and eventually have clean energy solutions and reduce our carbon output. Many believe that only a capitalist system can produce these technologies, that the, quote, innovation and free market that are supposedly inherent to this system will bring about the creativity that is needed to solve the problem of our ecological crisis. However, under capitalism, the market isn't free. It is controlled and regulated by billion-dollar corporations, and green technology isn't used to actually provide a solution to the climate crisis. It is used to sustain an ever-expanding system of profit at the expense of our planet. Over the years, we have seen a real push for the development and use of renewable sources of energy. Solar and wind energy are the most reliable and affordable forms of green technology, as they can be harnessed in all areas of the world, and being a truly renewable source, they are abundant and available every day. Solar panels and wind turbines do not produce toxic emissions, providing a critical solution to the use and extraction of fossil fuels. Despite these benefits, under our current system, renewable sources of energy are not being implemented and invested in at the rate we need to resolve this climate crisis. Despite both forms of technology existing for decades, we have not seen their use until recently because fossil fuels have been and still are more profitable for the capitalist class. Even now, as solar panels and wind turbines have become more widely used, it has become privatized and commodified by corporations and unaffordable for the average person to use. Instead of using the technology on a mass scale to be more energy efficient and clean, capitalists would rather make profit off of the selling of green technologies, regardless of the positive impact they can make. When we do see this technology used on a mass scale, it is usually to further push expansion and profit. For example, since 2005, Walmart has promised to work on becoming more energy efficient and to invest in greener methods of practice. Today, most Walmart locations have solar panels on their roofs and LED light bulbs in their stores. However, this wasn't done out of the goodwill of the environment, as Walmart has completely failed to meet any of the energy efficiency goals it set for itself 14 years ago. But it was done to cut costs and create greater profit, using the saved money to open more stores, filled with commodities that still rely on our limited resources. Under capitalism, implementing green technology doesn't imply a greener economy. This phenomenon we see with renewable energy is also echoed with electric vehicles. The technology for electric cars that release zero carbon emissions has existed since the early 1900s. Today, we see mostly hybrid cars, vehicles that are partially electric but still run on gas, because car manufacturers aren't quite ready to divest themselves from the payoff of the fossil fuel industry. We are beginning to see the production of electric cars today, like the Nissan Leaf and Chevy Volt, But again, this technology is unaffordable for the majority of people. Rather than creating a mass public transportation system that uses the same green technology, this technology is sold individually for tens of thousands of dollars. Both of these instances are results of the formation of a green market. Corporations over the past couple of decades have been competing to outdo each other, using environmental buzzwords and boasting environmentally safe practices to portray themselves as progressive and socially responsible to their consumers, all to build a loyal consumer base and expand their production and profits. Environmentalists and in businesses alike have encouraged people to vote with their wallet by supporting these supposed green corporations. The main business offensive in the past has been that climate change can be averted solely by greening consumer behavior rather than by curbing economic growth and mass consumerism. This is a practice that places the responsibility on the individual rather than the corporation. What we see here is a tailoring of environmental crises so they can be dealt with in ways that are not threatening to the status quo of today's economic and political structure. The fact that accumulation and expansion is the single drumbeat of capitalist society means that ecological systems and biological health systems of species are stretched to the limits, leading to ever-increasing risk. In a society organized with this one goal in mind, it is natural enough to respond to the threat of global warming by turning to riskier technologies. Considering alternative technologies, nuclear energy is often brought up in the conversation. Many see nuclear power as an energy alternative and partial technological answer to the use of fossil fuels. However, nuclear releases 9 to 25 times the carbon emissions of wind energy, and the dangers of nuclear are enormous, given that radioactive waste lasts hundreds and thousands of years. We've seen the horrific effects of nuclear disasters in the past with Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and most recent being the 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan. Nuclear plants take about 10 years to build and are extremely costly and uneconomic. It has been estimated that to satisfy the world's electrical power demands through nuclear energy, it would require building a nuclear power plant every day for the next 43 years. Just building 5% of these would double the world's current nuclear power installations worldwide, increasing the chance of another disaster. One final aspect to consider when it comes to nuclear energy is that it is closely tied to the development of nuclear weapons. The leftover materials made to make nuclear energy can be reprocessed into weapons-grade material, which is, of course, a major concern for all of humanity and our planet. Feeling the enormous dangers of climate change today, a new desperate search of high-tech fixes has emerged in geoengineering. Backed by today's billionaire class and even major environmental groups like the Environmental Defense Fund, geoengineering is the deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's natural systems to counteract climate change. A vast number of geoengineering schemes have been proposed to either take CO2 out of the atmosphere or to increase the reflectance of the sunlight back into space away from Earth. So I'm just going to read off a couple of geoengineering schemes so you get a taste of what this is about. So 1, fertilizing the oceans with iron to stimulate algal growth to absorb carbon, and reforesting the planet with genetically altered fast-growing trees. 2, decrease solar energy absorbed by the Earth by means of enhanced sunlight reflection schemes, such as white islands in the ocean, creating large satellites to reflect incoming sunlight, contaminating the stratosphere with sulfur dioxide particles that reflect light and promote global dimming. 3, conducting geoengineering carbon sequestration on a massive scale. Here, the assumption is that physics and economics will allow the capture of carbon and use large machines distributed around the world will make it possible to scrub CO2 from the atmosphere itself, instead of from individual industrial plant emissions. After trapping the CO2, it would then be liquefied for disposal. No one knows what detrimental side effects may occur from these wildly insane schemes. Geoengineering is a huge risk. It's playing God with the planet. Applying iron to the oceans just might lead to more dead zones and dumping sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to block sunlight could reduce photosynthesis throughout the planet. Another idea of geoengineering is carbon capture and storage, or CCS technology. This technology is designed to remove carbon from the air prior to its being released in the atmosphere and turn it into a non-harmful substance that can be injected into geological formations or into the ocean. This technology requires enormous economic costs and fuel costs to operate. The injection of captured carbon into the ocean would increase the acidity of the ocean, with consequences potentially as large as climate change itself. Instead of curbing economic expansion and divesting from pollutive industries, the billionaire class would rather continue to worsen the climate crisis and come up with large, ridiculously costly, and near impossible schemes to try to counteract the effects so they can continue to fill their pockets. As it is, this technology isn't even available until 2030, which will be much too late to try to change anything. Capitalism sure is creative when it comes to finding ways to defend and preserve the system. Environmentalists who resort to supporting geoengineering solutions do so because they see no other way for a capitalist economic system to solve climate change. Looking at these technologies and their uses, it is clear to see that technologies are used as market-based solutions under capitalism. When faced with something as dangerous and prescient as climate change, an event affecting millions of people, causing the sixth mass extinction and irreparably damaging our planet, capitalism uses technology to keep the economic system in its place, to ensure continued profit rather than ensure our future. Billionaires want to own both green and dirty technology. We cannot solve the climate crisis with high-tech fixes under a system that requires constant growth. Technology is not the only solution to the climate crisis. A complete system change is. We need a system where renewable energy and green technology don't belong to the private interests, but belong to the people. Thank you.
That was Karina Rogers speaking at the 2019 Party for Socialism and Liberation, Albuquerque's Eco-Socialism Conference, where people from all across the Southwest attended. Next, we are going to hear Chris Banks, who also spoke at this same conference, largely on socialist and capitalist solutions, or lack of solutions in the capitalist case, to the climate crisis that we're facing.
I want to take a little bit of time to talk more about the Green New Deal, which Ben spoke about, just because it's really the most popular kind of reform proposal right now. And we're not only seeing it debated at the federal level, but several bills have been passed at the state level, like in New Mexico, that are framed as mini Green New Deals. So as Ben said, earlier this year, on February 7th, actually, a non-binding resolution called the Green New Deal was introduced into the House by House Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Jeff Markley. There's been Green New Deals before coming out of the Green Party, but this is the most recent Green New Deal. It calls for a committee to be set up to draft legislation that could implement the Green New Deal. The deal calls for achieving net zero global emissions by 2050. Additionally, it calls for building resiliency against climate disasters, upgrading infrastructure, meeting 100% of energy demands with renewable emission-free sources, upgrading existing buildings and the power grid, growth in clean manufacturing, investment in sustainable farming, zero-emission vehicle and clean public transit expansion, among other progressive things. The resolution connects this to a wide array of social issues like income inequality, guaranteed employment, and justice for oppressed communities. The goals outlined in the Green New Deal are truly important and will be required by any plan that hopes to confront climate crisis. So far, the biggest threat to the Green New Deal is coming from the Democratic Party itself. Corporate-controlled Democratic Party bosses, like everybody's favorite, Nancy Pelosi, really hates the idea of the bill and makes fun of it. But it's not just her. Most of the other Democrats elected to Congress are also corporate-controlled, and they also hate the idea. A few say they support the Green New Deal. So Republicans went ahead and brought it to the floor of the Senate for a vote back in March. They knew that most Democrats' support wasn't real, that they were posturing, and wanted to call their bluff. And when it was brought to a vote in the Senate, all the Democrats in the Senate abstained so they wouldn't have to be embarrassed by voting no. So the Green New Deal, because of its non-binding character and the fact that it lacks support from either party, has the feel more of a call to action than anything else. And a call to action isn't bad. A call to action can be designed to mobilize millions of people to create a mass movement, which can then become the decisive factor in bringing about change. Understood as a call to action, the question then becomes, what will the final destination of that militant mass action be? What are the possible outcomes? Will all the potential energy unleashed by that call to action end up with something disfigured by corporate interests, which would be called a capitalist Green New Deal? Or will it break from private ownership and profits and become a socialist Green Deal? That's really the question when it comes to the Green New Deal. Will it end up being a capitalist Green New Deal designed to save capitalism from climate change, which is impossible? Or will it end up being a socialist Green Deal designed to break up corporate planning and control over society and move towards socialism? While the Green New Deal has some of the right demands, so far at least, the perspective put forward by the Green New Deal and most of the mechanisms proposed by the Green New Deal are well within the confines of capitalism. And here I'm talking about the resolution itself. The movement could move things beyond this, but the resolution itself doesn't actually touch the property relations that are at the base of the problem. Nowhere does it say that the new green energy infrastructure, which would be paid for by us, would be publicly owned, meaning it'll likely be owned by the biggest enemies of the planet, profit-seeking capitalists. There is no mention of nationalizing the fossil fuel industries or energy monopolies, nor other critically important sectors of the economy necessary for a rapid transformation away from carbon. It says that the green sector of the economy would either be owned together by the capitalist-run government and by capitalist-owned private corporations. They call that a public-private partnership. Or it would just be all owned entirely by corporations, but financed and paid for, but not controlled by you and me, the public. All this is based on the assumption that the enemies of the planet will become the saviors of the planet once it becomes profitable and risk-free enough. The Green New Deal also says there will be some opportunities for cooperatives in there too, and that those cooperatives will be allowed to engage in open competition with privately owned multinational corporations who have access to virtually unlimited resources and are backed up by the banks, which are themselves backed up by the capitalist state. In other words, there isn't much of a competition. A capitalist society, and this is true for capitalists themselves, have the characteristics, I think as has been demonstrated here today, of sociopaths. Production for the sole purpose of making profit and endless expansion, regardless of what happens to the majority of people and the environment. And just think about the Amazon right now, the Earth's lungs burning. That lack of empathy is sociopathic. and is pretty much celebrated as a virtue under capitalism. They call it ambition, but having little to no consideration for others and only regard for self-interest is sociopathic. So, most of the Green New Deal mechanisms take this timid approach that get referred to all the time, like public-private partnerships, or getting all the stakeholders around a seat at the table, or developing a public option to compete with a private option. And that is really just like saying, hey, let's you and I, the people, go demand a partnership with sociopaths to save the planet. Let's go fight for a seat at the table with some sociopaths to save the planet. Or let's go compete fair and square in a marketplace whose rules and regulations were created by sociopaths to benefit themselves. That doesn't sound like a good idea if our goal is to save the planet. Regulating the sociopaths is no way out either, especially when you have this whole phenomena of regulators being in bed with the capitalist firms that they are supposed to regulate. Or the revolving door where one day someone is running the business and the next day they are supposed to regulate the same business. You also have, from the point of view of the capitalist, that person who lacks empathy for the people and the planet, that calculation that the cost of implementing regulations is more costly than the penalties for not implementing regulations. So they just ignore the regulations, pay the fines, and move on. So there is really no reason for the timid approach of the Green New Deal. There's no reason for us to take the timid approach of the Green New Deal, especially when we have such a limited amount of time. We need to say we don't want to partner with sociopaths. We don't need to be demanding a seat at the table with sociopaths. We should want all the seats for ourselves. And it makes no sense to regulate sociopaths, which is just arm wrestling with them for eternity, knowing that they only care about the profits of their own firms. We should not be timid about saying that the way to get control over climate change and mitigate climate change is not through partnership with sociopaths, but through a people's economy, that we plan ourselves without needing to think about profits. And that gets to the main point. When we talk about what an ecological society would look like and what its operating procedures would be, one of the things that we need is planning. Some people treat planning as if it is a bad word, but no ecological and egalitarian society will be possible without planning. Resource allocation needs to be socially planned. In a capitalist society like this one, the capitalists plan the economy. They own everything and engage in production for the sole purpose of making profits and satisfying their private interests. That's why they can't fix climate change. They may be able to plan production in their own enterprise, but ultimately they have to compete to survive. So lack of coordination and cooperation prevails in their system. Competition for profits means different corporations won't cooperate. They hate cooperation and fight against it. Making adjustments based on a unified plan is completely out of the question, even though that is exactly what is needed today on a global scale. So the alternative is people's control and people's collective planning of the economy, and that is socialism. And planning and coordination would take place at every level, from the bottom, from the top, and really everywhere in between. There has to be planning and participation at every single level. And that would open up really the only possible way to reverse and mitigate the destruction of the planet. Planning would be democratic, it would be social, and that means we would be the ones doing it. Working and poor people, the ones that make all the stuff in the economy and deliver all the services, we would set the agenda and we would carry out the agenda. We wouldn't have to fight the 1/100th of 1% anymore, because instead of getting rich by owning stuff, which requires literally no work, they would have to go out and get a job and work just like the rest of us. Without profits in the way, science could finally guide our planning. The needs of the people around the world could finally guide our planning, and the needs of our environment could finally guide our planning. Every decision on what to do with energy, what to build, what energy resources to use, and the methods to build and produce would be decided and planned collectively and freely by working and poor people in the institutions we would build. As we think about how human society must be restructured around the world due to climate change, we can't afford to ignore the important attempts at ecological and socialist planning that have taken place around the world before today and are taking place now as we speak. For example, even though the Soviet Union is falsely presented as having a non-existent, ecologically informed society and a non-existent critical thought on the environment, they actually made many achievements from which to study and learn. On the one hand, while rapid industrial development, which began after the First World War and continued after World War II, led to all of the same environmental problems as it did in capitalist countries in the West, the Soviet Union also, in reaction to those calamities, developed some of the world's most important contributions to global ecological thinking. And they were doing it before any of these concepts were accepted worldwide as they are today, revolutionizing the fields of climatology and pioneering forms of conservation. It was from Moscow and Leningrad, not from Washington and New York, that the first warnings of runaway global warming occurred. And the first international conferences on the topic were organized by scientists from the Soviet Union. After the unimaginable destruction of World War II, in attempts to restore the environment and reverse regional temperature changes in deforested areas, the Soviet Union developed the largest reforestation plan in world history up to that point. 2.5 million acres of new forests were planted. The best old-growth forests in Russia were protected for ecological reasons, which added up to an area the size of Mexico, which is about 2/3 the size of the United States. All protected. All that preservation of forests was eventually done away with, not during the Soviet period, but after the Soviet period, when socialism disappeared and capitalism was restored. Soviet ecological analysis, really from the 50s onward, was far ahead of ecological thought in the West throughout the entire century. By the 70s and 80s, there were huge successes in reducing emissions of air and water pollution. The pressure of keeping up with the US military, who had unleashed the Cold War on the Soviet Union, interfered with a lot of this. But by the 80s, the environmental movement was huge and powerful, and the Soviet Union boasted of the largest environmental organization in the world. Following disasters like Chernobyl, plants across the country were being closed. Projects were being redone to be environmentally safe. Other projects were being canceled. Over 1,000 large enterprises were shut down. Carbon emissions peaked in 1988 and started to be reduced during the 3 years before capitalism was finally restored in 1991. It is sad that this rapid ecological restructuring and the positive achievements of planning were not allowed to develop further into the age of computerization. Another example of people's planning is to look at Cuba, a very different context. In addition to their achievements in the realms of health and education, which are well known, they have made huge achievements in the environmental field. The World Wildlife Fund ranked Cuba as having the most sustainable model of development on the planet. The global we can clap about that. The Global Footprint Network found Cuba to be only one of 8 countries in the world that meets the United Nations conditions for sustainable development. 2 of those conditions being the satisfactory well-being of its residents and living within the resource budget of the planet. Cuba's new constitution acknowledges climate change as a threat. And in 2017, Cuba embarked on a 100-year plan called Project Life to protect itself from climate change. Something they play, and just compare that, to the Green New Deal, perhaps, but something they played virtually no role in creating, that is climate change. The program bans construction of new homes in threatened coastal areas, calls for an overhaul of the country's agricultural system to shift crop production away from saltwater contaminated areas, and spells out the need to shore up coastal defenses, including by restoring degraded habitats. The plan aims to relocate people from communities doomed by rising sea levels. As we speak, Cuban social scientists are fanning out across those villages to educate people on climate change and win them over to the idea of the need to move. Marine scientist David Guggenheim, president of Ocean Doctor, a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., said Project Life was impressive. He said, Cuba is an unusual country in that they actually respect their scientists, and their climate change policy is science-driven. The plan took 10 years of research, 103 different studies about how to confront and adapt to climate change, and the plan describes the locations and the actions to be taken by 2020, 2050, and 2100. The plan is constantly being revised and updated as it is implemented. And all this is being done even though Cuba is cash-strapped because of the illegal U.S. economic blockade. They are able to do it because they have a planned economy that refuses to acknowledge the right of psychopaths to sit at the table as stakeholders. What would a project Life look like in the United States? Free from the constraints of a tiny group of private owners that make decisions based on what will make them the most money. What would a democratically planned and reorganized economy look like right here in the United States? And what would we do to truly help our sisters and brothers around the world to transform the system everywhere? It's going to take a monumental effort to convince a large number of people that a society where resources are allocated according to a social and ecological plan is not only desirable and needed, but is possible. And that we can and must overcome the resistance of corporate polluters and owners. From that point of view, we, the working class and poor, and this is the view of the PSL, need a political party of our own. The Democratic Party, which can't even get behind a non-binding Green New Deal resolution, promotes dependence on individual politicians who are themselves dependent on big corporations. We believe the working class should be dependent on itself. If we see the Green New Deal as a call to action, and if we want that growing movement to bring us closer to an ecological and socialist revolution, and not the opposite, prevent that revolution in order to save capitalism, which is what Biden and Warren and Harris want, then we need to find our own class voice. We need to make our own class organizations, guided by our own class interests. Who here is ready to fight for socialism? Thank you.
That was Chris Banks from PSL Albuquerque. We have one last speech that we're going to have time to play in this episode. You are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. So for our last speech, you are going to hear from Satya Vati. People's Republic, of course, is broadcast first on KOOP 91.7 FM and is also available on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. So for our last interview, this is Satya Vati from the PSL Eco-Socialism Conference.
So another 4 years and another election. 2020 elections are almost here, and climate change, nothing less than an existential issue in our lifetime, is a flashpoint in the 2020 Democratic Party debates. For the past 4 years, the Democratic Party elites kept busy trashing Trump, the individual who is supposed to be the devil, while having little to say about the capitalist system that produced him. And a majority of their time and attention was spent on the Trump-Russia hoax, which essentially collapsed with the findings of the Mueller investigation. This is how the capitalist politicians kept themselves relevant for the past 4 years, while mass poverty, child hunger, racist deportations, homelessness, tuition hikes, unaffordable health care, environmental degradation, endless wars remain much of the same or have worsened. Now it's election time once again. The Democratic Party politicians' focus on climate change this election season is a result of the pressure they feel from the grassroots movement and its base, regular working class people who are extremely concerned about the potential of living in a world unrecognizable to them in the coming decades. CNN was planning to even host a climate crisis town hall for next month in which 10 Democrat presidential candidates would have debated. But just 2 days ago, the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, rejected the proposal for a single issue debate. This general shift in the politicians' focus on climate change, however, is because they feel that they can no longer ignore us working class people in this country who not only want to see a serious discussion, but want immediate radical action on climate change. Climate change, which is really only one aspect of the ecological devastation under capitalism, as we made it very clear here today. The politicians understand that there would be a political cost to pay if they don't at least pay lip service to this issue. But third party and independent candidates are excluded from the election debates. These debates are watched by tens of millions of people across the country. Nearly half of the voters in the 2016 elections registered as independent rather than pledged themselves to either of the two ruling parties. The Commission on Presidential Debates, the organization that hosts the election debates, is a private corporation made up of billion-dollar companies like Anheuser-Busch and Philip Morris. It was created in 1988 as a pact between the Democratic and Republican parties to stage manage the debates, pre-select the debate moderators and topics. The fact that only the Republican and Democratic Party candidates are given access to the presidential debates is a flagrant violation and mockery of the concept of democracy. The debates are in many ways a farce and a sham, as is capitalist democracy, a system of guaranteed rule of the rich with the appearance of choice. Two parties that serve the billionaire capitalist class and work to preserve the status quo. And every 4 to 8 years, the two parties take turns. They switch out. In previous years, when the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, has run presidential candidates to use a national platform to promote a socialist program, we were never given the opportunity to be on national television to debate, challenge, and expose the representatives of the two corporate parties and their progressive posturing. Any alternative perspective that fundamentally questions and threatens the two-party system is denied voice in this country. Socialists like us are excluded deliberately in a calculated way so that the two parties can carry on business as usual. In this election cycle, clearly, Joe Biden is the preferred candidate of dominant sections of the ruling class, which is Wall Street banks, military contractors, private prisons, telecommunication tycoons, oil and gas industry, the imperialist foreign policy establishment, and much of the Fortune 500 companies. But we are not buying what politicians like Joe Biden are selling. If the PSL were to be on that debate stage for the 2020 election cycle, debating one of the leading Democratic Party candidates like Joe Biden, what would we have to say? What would aspects of a socialist program to address climate change look like? So let's break down Democrat candidate Joe Biden's so-called plan for a clean energy revolution and environmental justice. First, Joe Biden promises to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, which sets an objective to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, which we would say is the easiest and laziest thing that he could possibly do. And I'll explain why. When the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017 to restore the coal industry, which something even the coal industry doesn't really think is possible, and when Trump abandons the climate agreement to roll back all environmental regulations, a ton of large energy companies and other major corporations asked Trump to stay in the agreement. Why? Because energy and extraction corporations feel a fire under their behinds from global lawsuits and organized resistance by impacted communities and concerned people demanding accountability for climate change and the destruction of their ecosystems. U.S. corporations would rather the U.S. stay in the Paris Climate Agreement because it is good PR for them. James Hansen, the world's most prominent climate scientist, called the Paris Climate Agreement a fraud. It is not a science-based deal. In his own words, he said, quote, "It's just worthless words. There is no action, just promises." And we agree. It's an unenforceable agreement, an agreement that this or that capitalist politician in the U.S. can abandon at any point with no consequences. As long as fossil fuels appear to be the most profitable option, corporations will continue to burn them. In reality, to keep temperatures below a 2-degree rise, we will have to keep 80% of all fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. We socialists would see to it that an emissions reduction agreement between nations is based in scientific findings, binding, enforceable, accountable to the people of the world, prioritized and carried out rapidly. That fossil fuel use be essentially banned and the energy sector be nationalized, brought into public ownership. That such an agreement between the nations of the world must be based on cooperation, not competition, and willful exchange of the necessary resources and technology between the richer and the poorer countries to whom a debt is owed, with the industrially developed imperialist nations, the so-called first world countries that are responsible for the majority of the greenhouse emissions over the past 2 centuries, carrying the bulk of the responsibility in reversing this trend. Next, Biden's campaign promises to invest a measly $1.7 trillion for the next 30 years in research and development and zero carbon technologies. So that by 2050, we would have 100% clean energy and net zero emissions. This is outrageous. Scientists say we have about 12 years to fix climate change before it's a point of no return. And politicians like Biden feel no real urgency, even though the technology to transition exists and a national emergency could be declared today if the U.S. political establishment were to choose to. But they won't do it because their real concern is for the profits that the fossil fuel industry capitalists would lose out on if a radical transition occurs. Second, the question we all have to ask is why only 1.7 trillion will be allocated over 30 years to transition when the U.S. government has no trouble allocating over 1 trillion, that's a trillion with a T, every single year to U.S. military operations and a massive expansion of the U.S. nuclear arsenal for endless racist wars. As the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, the Pentagon is also one of the largest contributors to climate change globally. Yet the Department of Defense has a blanket exemption from all greenhouse gas treaties. And nowhere in Joe Biden's program to address climate change or in the new Green Deal being proposed by the more progressive Democrat candidates is the murderous and polluting role of U.S. militarism given any real attention, let alone barely mentioned. It is not just the Republicans who allow the military to pollute at will. When Obama issued an executive order requiring the U.S. government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the Pentagon was exempted from even having to report its emissions. It's not just the Pentagon. CEOs of companies like ExxonMobil, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman are laughing all the way to the bank. With no restriction on the way the Pentagon operates, corporations that make up the military-industrial complex and service the U.S. military are bringing in enormous profits. An example of this two-faced game that the U.S. politicians are playing is when in 2016, the Obama administration pledged to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, while at the same time ordering the Pentagon to plan for national security issues arising from climate change. Meaning, as the world spirals into chaos with mass displacement due to sea level rise, extreme weather, and drought-driven starvation, the Pentagon will protect the imperialist ruling class. The wealthy imperialist countries with the resources to do so will build virtual fortresses around their countries, preserving resources for themselves, while the countries they have looted from for centuries struggle to access food, clean water, or energy. Already under both major ruling parties, millions of people are deported and millions more continue to be imprisoned then sent back for seeking political or economic asylum. Hundreds of millions of people are projected to be displaced globally due to environmental and climate catastrophe. We need not imagine what the imperialist U.S. government will do to these people when they show up at its doorstep asking for refuge. To this, we would say, building walls and more bombs is the antithesis of a solution at a time when cooperation and pooling of resources across borders is the only salvation for humanity and all living things. And for the PSL, stopping U.S. wars and standing in solidarity with the people of the world fighting U.S. imperialism is non-negotiable. We would shut down the largest polluting institution in the world, the Pentagon, the U.S. military, and establish some form of a working-class civilian militia to be trained to defend. No more war, no more deportations, no more occupations or walls, sanctions, and regime changes. All the resources currently channeled into the U.S. death machine must be redirected toward life. This will have immediate environmental benefits. It will decrease global tensions. Peace is our only chance for a future in which people throughout the world approach common problems cooperatively. Now let's get back to Biden's revolutionary plan to fight climate change. In his campaign video, Biden says things like, the U.S. is only responsible for 15% of global emissions. Global action requires American leadership. We will make every nation go beyond their initial commitment, especially true for China, by far the world's largest emitter of carbon, he said. These statements are not only arrogant in nature, they're also half-truths and factually inaccurate. It is true that the U.S. today emits about 15% of the global carbon dioxide emissions just from fossil fuels, and China emits about 28%. But the U.S. is also responsible for almost one-third, so about 33% of the total excess carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere, while China is actually responsible for less than a sixth of the total. So how can this be? Between 1850 and 1960, the industrializing capitalist economies of the European countries that colonized most of the world and the United States dominated emissions. From 1960 to 2005, the United States was the biggest CO2 emitter in the world. It wasn't until 2005 that China surpassed the United States as the biggest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. But the way US politicians talk about China, you think that China is responsible for ruining the earth single-handedly and that the US imperialists have no part in it. The population of the US is just over 4% of the world's population. China, on the other hand, has a population of 1.4 billion people. China, once a colonized, underdeveloped country, has had to develop its industry and infrastructure rapidly to attempt to meet the needs of over 1 billion people. And still, the Chinese actually burn less than half as much fossil fuel on average, so per capita, than Americans do. With just over 4% of the world's population, the United States uses 1/4 of the world's fossil fuel resources, completely unsustainable and destructive to the planet. China, on the other hand, is on track to meeting its climate change goals 9 years earlier than planned under the Paris Agreement. China is made out to be considered the boogeyman of global climate diplomacy by the United States government. But China is becoming the largest investor in solar and wind technology and provides more jobs in solar energy than in coal mining. China has invested in clean energy on an unprecedented scale and has installed more renewable capacity than any other country in the world. Today, it is responsible for 1/3 of all wind turbines and solar panels in the world. It now has almost half the world's electric vehicles and charging infrastructure and 99% of the world's electric buses. Contrary to Joe Biden's posturing about the US having to, quote, hold Chinese leaders accountable for reducing carbon, it is China that is leading while the US is sitting on the sidelines waiting for other countries to do the work that it has the responsibility to do. The imperialist countries that contributed the most to climate change historically are doing the least. But what they are experts at doing is scapegoating and trashing China every chance they get. We know that this anti-China and anti-Russia demonization campaigns underway are ultimately about US imperialism gearing up for a major confrontation against China and Russia, both countries whom the US sees as economic and political barriers to its own unrestricted domination and plunder of the world. And we are being prepared, we the people in the US are being prepared and conditioned to prevent a homegrown opposition to a major devastating US war in the future. But Biden doesn't stop there on China. He goes on to say that China should be stopped from, quote, financing dirty fossil fuel projects all across Asia. Like all US imperialists, what Biden means is that the US government must put a stop to China's economic development, as well as China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is allowing for infrastructural development in 152 countries in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America that have been kept in a state of perpetual underdevelopment through centuries of colonialism and economic subjugation using imperialist financial institutions. This is what the imperialist US politicians are against, the rest of the world developing. For all the decades that the US was the primary trading partner of African countries, the continent for the most part remained impoverished. US imperialism would rather that the people of the global South be kept in a state of economic dependency. It's also important that I mention that since the 50s, majority of the US manufacturing has been shipped off to these same developing countries by multinational corporations to derive super profits from super exploitation of third world labor, what the capitalists call as cheap labor. So capitalism is a system based in competition and a never-ending drive for profits using unrestricted growth and overproduction. But we reject such a world system. We stand for socialism, a system based in cooperation and mutual aid between nations to sustainably meet the needs of all people, which is really only possible if the economy is planned by the working class for the working class, so we can prevent wasteful overproduction and establish a pathway to a zero-waste society. So if we had a revolution in this country, if the US had a socialist government in power, so much would be possible. A massive redirection and reorientation of resources and scientific study to addressing and reversing the ecological catastrophe plaguing the global working class. Workers and the millions of unemployed people would be trained and transitioned into environmentally sustainable jobs using the instrument of a planned economy. And remember, unemployment is a permanent feature of capitalism. The basic needs of all people would be met in a sustainable way by bringing into public ownership the means of production and distribution, which will guarantee the right of all people to housing, education, healthcare, and food. Unrestricted growth of urban population centers, which is completely unsustainable, would be addressed. There would be no place for environmental racism under a socialist government that would recognize and respect self-determination for historically oppressed nations of people inside and outside the US. We would export green technology, not bombs. We would export trained scientists and technicians and share our resources, expertise, and scientific knowledge with the world and vice versa. The countries around the world that continue to divert their limited resources to defend themselves from US military invasions would no longer have to do so. We would lift unjust criminal economic sanctions on countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, DPRK, North Korea. So sisters and brothers, this is not the time to be pessimistic. This is not the time to give up on ourselves and give into the future that the capitalist class has paved way for us. The mainstream solutions to climate change don't talk about the reorganization of society or the need for a new system. They want to fight climate change without wrecking the profit margins for the mass polluters, the capitalists, the corporations. We are out of time for incremental change. We need radical change. But a revolution is what it will take. And revolution means an overthrow of one mode of production with another, one type of political economic system with another, which is what we propose, a real revolution. Revolution in the United States is not only possible, but it is imperative. As the U.S. moves toward major confrontation with China and Russia, nuclear catastrophe is what awaits us all. Don't wait on politicians. Only working class struggle has the power to stop the course we have been put on. We must build a mass movement from thousands to millions of people. Get organized into a revolutionary organization today. Join the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Fight back. Thank you.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.